This is one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in Charleston. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what time it is when you are listening to this narration. We want to know where these documented stories go and when they get there. The first written record of Ruth Mayfield was on the 19th of December, 1843, in the parish records of St. Philip's Church in Charleston. It was not a baptism or marriage, but an inventory item. One female Negro, approximately 23 years of age, valued at $800. Her name was written in the margin by a different person than the official record keeper. Ruth. Only Ruth. The last name Mayfield would come later, not by choice, but by ownership. The Preston Mayfield estate was 3 miles outside of Charleston proper, along the Ashley River. The property went back to 1796, when cotton was still a way for people to get rich by making other people do the work. By 1843, the grandeur had faded a bit. There were cracks near the bases of the white columns on the main house. The slave quarters, stables, and storage sheds outside the house were a little crooked, as if they were tired from holding up what happened inside. The Charleston County Records Office found the Mayfield ledgers while renovating the building in 1962. They show every business deal the estate made between 1839 and 1852. Ruth's name comes up more and more in these entries. Her purchase on the 19th of December, 1843. Her first pregnancy recorded in April, 1844. She had given birth 9 times by March 1851. The 10th time she gave birth would be recorded in October of that year. It's not just the cold facts about the Mayfield case that are so disturbing. It's also what happened when a history student named Margaret Harlow started looking at letters between Ella Mayfield, the plantation mistress, and her sister in Baltimore. These letters, which were kept in a private collection until 1965, show a household practice that is so psychologically damaging that it is hard to understand, even in a time when there were so many inhumanities. Ruth's children were not raised as her own, but as Ella Lenaina's. They lived in the main house. Ruth had to take care of them as their nurse, but she couldn't say that she was their mother. Ruth had to be there every time one of her kids called Ella Lenaina Mama. When one of her kids walked by her in the hall without saying anything, she was expected to stay calm. The emotional structure of this arrangement, this planned psychological torture, is the main point of this documented case. The records say that Ruth's first child, a boy, was born in January 1845. They named him Thomas. Ella Lenaina wrote to her sister about, "My sweet little Thomas, who had come after a long wait." There is no mention of Ruth, except to say that she is a wet nurse who does her job well. Household records show that Ruth was moved from field work to the main house 3 weeks before the birth, which suggests that a plan was already in place. 7 months after Thomas was born, Ella Lenaina wrote to her sister, "The arrangement with the nurse is going very well. She doesn't show any inappropriate attachment to the child and comes right away when I call for him." Preston thinks our method is the best way to keep things in order. The letter goes on to talk about everyday household things, as if the psychological violence that was happening was no more important than changing linens or ordering supplies. Ruth had a second child, a girl named Sarah, by 1847. Ella Lenaina's letters become clearer. "We have set up a very effective system. The nurse knows that if the mother shows any affection toward either child, she will be separated from them right away, and the children will stay here with me. You would be surprised at how well behavior can be controlled when the stakes are made perfectly clear." According to tax records, the Preston Mayfield estate had 23 slaves in 1848. Interviews with descendants of people who had been enslaved on nearby plantations in the 1930 seconds suggest that people outside of the Mayfield property knew about Ruth's situation. When interviewed in 1936, 4-year-old Eliza Johnson remembered her grandmother talking about the woman who was mother to the white lady's children, and how it turned her quiet as a shadow, seeing her own flesh walking around not knowing her. According to county census records from 1850, Ruth had already had 7 children by that time. Preston and Ella Lenaina Mayfield were said to own all of them. Everyone was said to be white. It seems that Ruth's kids were also Preston's. But this biological fact was not publicly acknowledged and was privately, ruthlessly enforced against recognition. The kids grew up with their mother, but they didn't know her. They told her what to do, sometimes complained about her, and Ella Nena looked for any sign that her mother was paying attention to her every time they talked. Ella Nena's letters say that Ruth only tried to run away once, in the spring of 1849. Before she could get to the city limits of Charleston, she was caught and sent back to the plantation. In Ella Nena's letters, she described the punishment as making Ruth stand quietly in the corner of the nursery, while Ella Nena told Ruth's 5 oldest children that the nurse had tried to abandon them because she found them troublesome. The children, who were between 2 and 4 years old, were told to tell Ruth how they felt, and she wasn't allowed to respond. 2 weeks later, Ella Nena wrote, "The discipline has worked best. She does her job with perfect detachment now. I think she has fully learned the lesson." In 1958, when the Mayfield house was sold and its attic was cleaned out, workers found a small package hidden under the floorboards near the stairs that used to be for servants. There was a piece of cloth inside with 10 small things: a button, a polished chicken bone, a blue ribbon, a small stone, a dried flower, a thimble, a broken shell, a child's tooth, a lock of hair tied with thread, and a hand-carved wooden star. There were no papers with these things, so we can only guess what they mean. Dr. Catherine Wells, who wrote her 1967 dissertation at the University of Virginia about the Mayfield case, has said that this collection was Ruth's private motherhood, small things that were connected to each of her children and kept hidden so that she could get to them without being seen. Ruth could have had quick access to these tokens while moving between floors of the house because they were near the servant stairs. Dr. Wells wrote, "It represents a form of psychological resistance to an almost unimaginable cruelty, maintaining maternal connection through secret symbols when direct acknowledgement was forbidden." The normal records of 19th century Charleston society, such as school registrations, church confirmations, business deals, and eventually marriages and children of their own, show what happened in the children's lives. On paper, they seem like ordinary people who lived in Charleston before the Civil War. There is no evidence in history that they ever found out the truth about who their parents were. After 1853, there are no more records of Ruth. The 10th birth, recorded in October 1851, is the last time she is mentioned in the Mayfield household accounts. There is no death certificate, burial record, or sale document. Ella Nena writes in her last letter about Ruth, which is dated February 1853, "The nurse has been removed from the household. The younger children have been told she was called away to assist relatives. They accepted this explanation without question, as they have never been particularly attached to her." The clinical coldness of this final dismissal of a woman who had been subjected to a decade of psychological torture is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire Hive case. The system that tried to deny her humanity worked perfectly when they casually erased both her presence and her immense suffering. Dr. Wells tried to find Ruth's children's descendants in 1968 so he could tell them the truth about their family history. The Mayfield family descendants didn't want to take part in the study, and legal issues stopped Dr. Wells from publishing all of his findings. The court ordered that her research materials be sealed until 2018, when all of her immediate descendants would be dead. The University of Virginia Special Collections Library told our research team that the Wells materials are still sealed and that access is limited by the terms of a private legal settlement. In 1973, a fire destroyed the Mayfield house itself. They never found out what caused it. Local news reports said the fire was very strong, and the building fell in on itself as if it were being eaten from the inside out. There was only the stone foundation and some of the brick chimneys left. The property remained undeveloped for decades, with locals describing it as uncomfortable ground. Housing development finally began on the site in 1997, though construction workers reported unusual problems throughout the building process: tools disappearing, unexplained cold spots, and a persistent smell of smoke that engineers could never trace to a source. People who live in the houses that were built on the old Mayfield property have said that they don't have many problems. However, some have said that their kids don't want to play in some parts of their yards. For a 1,999 local history project, one homeowner said that her 4-year-old daughter wouldn't play near the old oak tree at the edge of their property. When asked why, the child is said to have said, "That's where the quiet lady stands and watches." Ruth Mayfield's story, in which she was systematically denied her identity as a mother and forced to watch her children's lives from a position of servitude, is an especially cruel example of the already inhumane institution of slavery. In 1862, during the second year of the Civil War, Preston Mayfield Jr., Ruth's eldest son, wrote a letter to his fiancée saying that he was willing to defend our way of life against Northern aggression. The letter, which is kept in the Charleston Historical Society archives, says, "I fight not merely for property or politics, but for the natural order of relations between the races which God in His wisdom has established for the benefit of all." The psychological structure of this arrangement exemplifies the core objective of slavery: not merely the exploitation of labor, but the intentional dismantling of human connections to consolidate power. The servants content in their place, the masters benevolent in their governance. The profound tragedy of these words, penned by an individual defending the very system that had deprived him of his mother, is inexpressible. He had been so deeply brainwashed by the idea of racial hierarchy that he would have died to protect it, not realizing how much it had changed his own life. Dr. Wells wrote in the published part of her research, "The case of Ruth Mayfield is the logical end of slavery's basic idea that some people can be completely owned by others. When ownership goes beyond labor to identity itself, we see the full psychological horror of the institution." Ruth was denied not only freedom of movement or freedom of choice, but also the most basic human connection, that between mother and child. Her story is perhaps the clearest example that slavery's greatest violence was not physical, but psychological, the systematic destruction of the self. In 1969, a former maid said she was the granddaughter of someone who worked in a house next door to the Mayfields. According to her story, which has been passed down through oral history, Ruth didn't go missing in 1853. Instead, she was locked up in the attic of the Mayfield house after trying to tell one of her children the truth. The claim couldn't be proven, and the woman didn't want to be formally interviewed after getting what she called threatening messages after her first statement. The last official document in the Mayfield case is a 1971 court decision that kept all records related to Dr. Wells's research secret until 2018. Judge William Harmon of the Charleston County Court made the decision based on potential distress to living descendants and the lack of conclusive evidence regarding certain claims. Dr. Wells passed away in 1986, and her full research results were never made public. When our research team went to the old Mayfield property in November of last year, we found a suburban neighborhood with nice homes. There is an unmarked stone memorial at the entrance to the neighborhood. The developers put it there as part of a deal with local historians who wanted the site's history to be officially recognized. The houses cost between $300,000 and $500,000. None of the people who live there now knew anything about the property's past. There is no writing on the stone, no mention of Ruth, and no mention of the 10 children she had who were not allowed to call her mother. It is just smooth granite that is slowly weathering in the Carolina sun. Maybe it's appropriate for a woman whose identity was systematically erased, whose connections to her mother were denied, and whose very existence was reduced to entries in household accounts. Somewhere in America today, the descendants of those 10 children live their lives without knowing that their family tree goes back not only to Preston and Elalana Mayfield, but also to a woman named Ruth who kept buttons, ribbons, and locks of hair as the only way she could show she was a mother. They are the living proof of a heritage that has been hidden on purpose. Their very existence shows how strong human bonds can be, even in the face of brutal systems that try to break them. At the end of this documentary, we still have questions instead of answers. What psychological impact did this arrangement have on the children, who were raised by their biological mother but were not allowed to know her as such? Did any of them have a gut feeling about the truth, sensing connections they couldn't put into words? What was Ruth thinking about as she quietly moved through the house, taking care of kids who were hers but could never know her? These questions have been around for a long time, and they may never be answered. The silence at the center of this story, which Ruth was forced to keep, says a lot about the systems that keep people from connecting with each other in order to keep power. The true horror of the Mayfield case lies in that silence, not a supernatural presence or a violent act, but the deliberate, sustained erasure of the most basic human bond, a mother forbidden to mother, children forbidden to know their origin, and a woman whose resistance took the form of small treasures hidden beneath the floor, each one a silent testament to love that could not be expressed but refused to be extinguished. In 1966, 3 years before the controversial testimony about Ruth's possible confinement, a construction worker who was fixing up the old caretaker's cottage on the edge of the Mayfield property found a small tin box buried under the hearthstones. There was a journal inside, but the pages were brittle and had been damaged by water, making most of the entries unreadable. The Charleston Historical Society received the journal, but they said it wasn't very valuable because it was in bad shape. They sent it back to the owners, who were said to have thrown it away. But a construction worker told a graduate student in 1972 who was looking into antebellum Charleston that several pages had clear writing on them that seemed to record observations of the Mayfield children. James Tanner, the worker, remembered things like "the youngest boy has her eyes exactly" and "today's reached for me before catching herself." Tanner thought the journal might have belonged to someone who knew Ruth's secret, maybe another servant in the house, or even a member of the extended Mayfield family who quietly saw the arrangement. The fact that someone in the Mayfield household may have known the truth but stayed quiet makes the case even more complicated. How many other people saw this psychological torture and did nothing? The silence of those involved went beyond the people who did it, making it possible for this kind of cruelty to go on for more than 10 years without anyone speaking out. Dr. Amelia Richardson, a psychology professor at Emory University, has looked into the Mayfield case using the few records that are available. Richardson's 2008 paper, Maternal Deprivation as Psychological Control in Antebellum Slave Households, says the Mayfield case is an extreme example of what was probably a more common practice than historical records show. By forcing enslaved women to care for their biological children as servants instead of mothers, slave owners created a particularly insidious form of psychological control that stole reproductive labor while destroying the basic human connection of motherhood. Richardson's research suggests that similar arrangements existed on other plantations, though perhaps not with the same systematic implementation as the Mayfield case. Within the perverse logic of slavery, the practice served multiple functions. It solidified the total ownership of enslaved women's bodies and reproductive abilities. It equipped domestic labor with inherent emotional control mechanisms, and it obstructed the establishment of familial bonds that could undermine the plantation's authority structure. Street Phillips Parish Church records show that Ruth's 10 children were all baptized between 1,845 and 1,852. Preston and Ella Lanina Mayfield are listed as the parents on each baptismal record. Ella Lanina wrote to her sister that Reverend Thomas Wentworth, the minister who led the ceremony, often came to dinner at the Mayfield estate. In a sermon from 1848 that is still in the church's archives, Reverend Wentworth talked about how God orders society and how Christians in positions of power should guide those who depend on them. He specifically praised unnamed parishioners who had taken extraordinary measures to ensure that children of unfortunate circumstance are raised with all the advantages of Christian civilization. The coded language almost certainly referred to the Mayfield arrangement, cloaking the psychological cruelty in religious justification. His involvement in recording these baptisms while knowing the children's real parents is another example of how the system supports the lie. Ruth had her 10th and last child, a girl named Mary, in October 1851. Ella Lanina's letters say that this child was much darker than her siblings, which makes it likely that Preston was not the father. This break from the usual pattern seems to have caused a crisis in the home. Ella Lanina's letters from this time are all over the place, talking about securing the family's reputation and addressing the nurse's moral lapse. By 1852, Mary is no longer mentioned in household records. There is no death certificate, but the Mayfield household accounts show that they paid Dr. James Harwood in November 1851 for medical services and discretion regarding household matter. The idea that the child may have been killed because of how she looked is too disturbing to ignore, even though there is no solid proof to back it up. It wasn't long after this that Ruth herself disappeared from the documentary record. This supports the idea that the crisis caused by Mary's birth led to Ruth being kicked out of the house, It is unclear whether this was done through sale, confinement, or something worse. It is hard to imagine how Ruth felt psychologically. She gave birth 10 times and was not allowed to be a mother to any of those children. She had to watch them grow up speaking with accents that were different from her own and taking in values and beliefs that justified her being enslaved. She had to clean their scraped knees, serve their meals, and wash their clothes, all while pretending that she was just a servant with no deeper connection. The daily psychological violence of this arrangement is worse than the physical violence of slavery. Dr. Richardson's research indicates fragmented evidence of Ruth's resistance in this ostensibly futile circumstance. The small things that each child has are one way of resisting, since they kept their connections to their mother's secret when they weren't allowed to do so in public. Elelenena's letters sometimes mention Ruth being corrected for improper familiarity with the children. This suggests that there were times when Ruth's maternal instincts broke through the facade of detachment she was trying to maintain. In a very revealing letter from 1847, Ellenena writes to her sister, "We had an incident yesterday. When Thomas fell from the garden wall and cut his forehead, before I could reach him, the nurse had gathered him up and was speaking to him in that language they use among themselves. Preston witnessed this display and administered correction immediately. They've restricted her access to Thomas for a fortnight to ensure the lesson is properly learned." This brief glimpse into Ruth's momentary lapse speaking to her injured child in Gullah. The Creole language spoken by enslaved people in the Carolina Low Country reveals both her instinctive maternal response and the harsh consequences of such natural human behavior within the Mayfield system. The fact that she would risk punishment to comfort her hurt child shows how strong maternal bonds can be, even when they are under the most extreme conditions of psychological oppression. After the Civil War, the Mayfield children's descendants, who also happened to be Ruth's descendants, spread out across the United States. Census records and genealogical databases show that they moved to cities like Atlanta, Richmond, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Many of them became middle or upper middle class professionals in fields like medicine, law, education, and business. A historian working on something else found letters between Ellenena Mayfield's nephew, William Cartwright, and a cousin in Philadelphia in 2009. The letters were from 1873, 20 years after Ruth's disappearance from the record. In this letter, Cartwright talks about going to the old Mayfield plantation, which was owned by another family at the time. He was disturbed by rumors that Aunt Ellenena's former nurse was still living in a remote cabin on the edge of the property, aged beyond her years, and speaking to no one. This makes it seem possible that Ruth lived long after she officially disappeared from the Mayfield records, maybe even in isolation on or near the property where her children grew up. If this is true, she would have seen the Civil War, the end of slavery, and the first years of Reconstruction. These were huge changes in society that came too late to fix her relationships with her mother. The Cartwright letter is the last historical record we have that might be about Ruth. If she lived into the 1870 seconds, she would have been in her 50 seconds. This is not old by today's standards, but she would have been older than her years because of all the pain and suffering she had been through. The letter doesn't say how long she might have stayed in that cabin by herself or what happened to her after that. Ruth's final fate is still one of the many painful gaps in this case because there is no clear historical evidence. Like many other enslaved people, her life was mostly recorded in property records and letters from people who said they owned her. Researchers today still don't have access to a lot of her thoughts, feelings, and experiences that can't be guessed from these biased sources. The collection of small treasures found under the servants' staircase may be the most telling piece of evidence in the entire Mayfield case. The button, ribbon, polished bone, and lock of hair all stand for an act of defiance that was so subtle that it went unnoticed, but so strong that it kept the bond between mother and child alive, even when they weren't allowed to show it in public. In the conclusion of her unpublished dissertation, Dr. Wells wrote, "The collection of keepsakes hidden beneath the Mayfield house floorboards represents a form of resistance history has only recently begun to recognize. The maintenance of human dignity and connection in circumstances designed to destroy both. Ruth created a shadow motherhood through these tokens, that existed alongside but hidden from the fiction maintained by the Mayfield household. Each object linked her to a child who could not know her, maintaining connections that the institution of slavery sought to dismantle. This type of resistance is very smart because it makes symbolic connections when real ones are not allowed. This shows how strong the human spirit is, even in the worst situations. Ruth, who wasn't allowed to openly mother her children, made a new kind of motherhood by making these small talismans, each one representing a child who couldn't acknowledge her. Sarah might have lost the blue ribbon from her hair while she was playing. Ruth may have made the polished chicken bone into a secret toy for her youngest son. It could be that the button came from Thomas's first formal jacket. Each item, which had no real value, was a unique link to children who were in her life every day but were cut off from her by the harsh social fiction of the Mayfield household. In 1959, when the small bundle of keepsakes was discovered during renovation of the Mayfield house, the items were photographed but considered of minimal historical importance. The Charleston County Historical Society has a copy of the picture in its archives. It shows things arranged on a white cloth, small worn things that would look like junk to people who don't know what they are. The collection was lost in the end, and there is no record of where the items went after they were documented. This loss is another erasure in Ruth's story. The physical proof of her secret resistance is gone, just like how her presence in her children's lives was systematically hidden. The pattern of erasure continues through the years, and each time a document is lost, it makes the historical traces of her life even harder to see. When the court ordered the sealed records of Dr. Wells's research to be opened in 2018, researchers found that many of the most important documents were missing. The removal of these materials, whether through legal means in later court cases or illegal means, is the final silencing of Ruth's story, which continues the original injustice into our own time. What is left are pieces. Ella Lenena's cold-blooded letters to her sister, sparse entries in household accounts, baptismal records that tell a made-up story, memories from descendants of people who lived on nearby plantations, and the unsettling silences where Ruth's own voice should be. From these fragments, we can piece together the outline of a terrible event, but we can never fully understand what the woman at the center of it went through. The Mayfield case compels us to acknowledge an unsettling reality regarding historical memory. Certain injustices are so deeply entrenched that they endure beyond the existence of the initial victims and offenders. The descendants of Ruth's children are alive today, but they don't know their true lineage. A system that was meant to cut the maternal bond at its source has erased part of their family history. This absence, this stolen ancestry, represents the longest-lasting impact of the Mayfield system. Dr. Richardson's recent research on intergenerational trauma in post-slavery societies posits that severed connections engender ghost limb phenomena within family systems, unconscious sensations of absence that endure across generations without a discernible source. She writes, "The descendants of Ruth's children may feel inexplicably lost or disconnected, emotional responses to a trauma they don't know about, but that has a huge impact on their family story." The last part of Ruth's story is still to be written. Maybe one day, new developments in genetic genealogy will help her descendants find out who their real ancestors are. Maybe someone from the Mayfield family will come forward with letters or journals that help us understand what happened to Ruth. Or maybe her story will stay the same, with some parts clear and some that will never be completely clear. What we do know with certainty is that in Charleston, South Carolina, between 1843 and 1853, a woman named Ruth endured a form of psychological torture designed specifically to deny her most fundamental human connection, that of mother to child. She fought back by doing little things to remember and protect her children, keeping her maternal ties secret even though she wasn't allowed to talk about them in public. And in America today, her descendants live on, with genetic traits and maybe even memories of a woman whose name was almost lost to history. Ruth's story isn't scary because of ghosts or graphic violence. It's scary because of the planned cruelty of the system that put her in jail. The system knew that the best way to control people was to target their hearts as well as their bodies. The Mayfield arrangement directly attacked the bond between mothers and children. This was so basic to human experience that its horror transcends time, warning us across the centuries about how cruel one group of people can be when they claim complete ownership over another. We have more questions than answers as we finish this documentary reconstruction. What happened to Ruth after 1853? Did any of her kids ever find out the truth? What happened to Mary, the 10th child, who is no longer listed? It may never be possible to fully answer these questions. But by asking them and not accepting the silence that the original perpetrators and later attempts to hide the full story have put in place, we are doing a small act of resistance, just like Ruth did when she collected keepsakes. We insist on remembering a woman who was supposed to be forgotten, even if we don't remember everything about her. Today, tour guides in Charleston take people through the historic district, pointing out interesting architectural details and telling sanitized stories about life before the Civil War. The Mayfield case doesn't come up very often in these stories. There is no historical marker on the subdivision built on the old plantation grounds that tells what happened there. The silence goes on, outlasting both Ruth and the people who wanted to get rid of her. But in that small group of things, a button, a ribbon, a lock of hair, we see a deep truth about how people can fight back even when things are really bad. Ruth found ways to keep being a mother. Each little treasure hidden under the floorboards was a reminder that the ties that slavery tried to break were still there, even if they were hidden. Ruth speaks to us across time through these tokens. I was here. I was their mother. I remembered, even when they couldn't. Maybe the best way to remember Ruth is not with a stone marker or a plaque, but by telling her story and refusing to let the silence that was forced on her in life and has continued long after her death be forgotten. By saying her name and talking about the specific cruelty she went through, we fight against the erasure that started in 1843 and has continued in different ways up to now. The Mayfield case's most horrifying aspect is its plausibility. We realize that such planned psychological cruelty existed in a system that those who profited from it defended as fair and natural. Ruth's story makes us face not supernatural fear, but the very human ability to create systems of control that attack the most basic human relationships. And in that acknowledgement resides the fundamental objective of documenting such instances, to guarantee that the imposed silence does not transform into a lasting obliteration.